It is easy to romanticize Finnish fighting forces of the first half of the 20th century, as they had a penchant for punching well above their weight class, and many of the initial U.S. Special Forces fighting men would be veterans of the Winter and Continuation Wars. What is more impressive is that the backbone rifle of the Finnish Army and Civil Guard is what many of us call the garbage rod, the M91 Mosin Nagant. While never producing a receiver for themselves, the Finns would improve upon the base rifle over time to field some of the highest quality examples of the Mosin. Since I'm satisfied that I've obtained a basic Finn Mosins collection, this will be the first in a series of videos on various models. My almost exclusive source for these videos is Finnish Mosin Nagant Three-Line Rifle to Ukko-Pekka by Matt DeRazio, and there will be a link to purchase this book from Wet Dog Publications in the description below. Since I've already made a video on the development of the Mosin Nagant in Russia, this video will concentrate on early independent Finnish history, the why, and their use of the M91 rifle. Finland was part of the Kingdom of Sweden until it became a part of the Russian Empire as a result of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. They remained fairly autonomous throughout the century, with Finns establishing military formations of their own. The Scandinavian Finnish population not messing with the ethnically Slavic Russians didn't seem to be much of a problem until Tsar Nicholas II began a Russification policy toward the end of the century, ending many of these semi-autonomous aspects. The Finnish formations would be dissolved and replaced with a tax that had to be paid to the Russian monarchy. This created resentment and resistance. During the First World War, many young Finns would enlist in the German army to fight against the Russians and form the backbone of the Royal Prussian 27th Jager Battalion. Many would be released to fight for the white side during the Finnish Civil War. The Russian Revolution in 1917 would finally create the conditions needed for Finland to declare its independence on December 6, 1917. Local militias formed, and the 80,000 Russian troops in the country were encouraged to leave. Like Russia, the country would split into the Reds and Whites, and a Finnish Civil War would begin on January 1918. While both sides consisted mainly of volunteers, the Whites would see a boost as returning Jagers would help form a professional background. Karl Gustav Mannerheim, a former Imperial Russian cavalry general, would split up and use the Jagers to train and lead the white militia and volunteers. This professional corps would be very instrumental in the Whites defeating the Reds in May 1918. The White Army would also see some help from 14,000 German soldiers. Atrocities were committed by both sides, and Finland would see around 1% of its population killed during the Civil War. There would be some border skirmishes referred to as the Kinship Wars. These would amount to attempts to expand to a greater Finland and attempt to help some border nations achieve independence. While Estonia did become independent, the Finnish government would basically paint these as actions of overzealous volunteers as to not poke the bear of their neighbor to the east. The Treaty of Tartu would establish the border between Finland and the Soviet Union on October 14, 1920. While they were wary of their neighbors to the east, Finland would have nearly 2 decades of relative peace to decide on and develop their military forces. One of these important decisions would be which rifle to use. The spoiler alert answer is they would end up choosing the Three-Line Rifle or M91 Mosin by default, although not every rifle was left in Finland by the Russians or used during the Finnish Civil War. After the conflict, there would be a consolidation of arms left by the Russians and Red Guards. The arms from the Great Gun Train were Finn Whites ambushed a train heading to the Finn Red Guards that was sent from St. Petersburg and was likely the source for the American Mosins in stock. Arms in private hands, which were likely war booty and other sources by the Army, Civil Guard, Navy, and various border guards. Of the 230,000 rifles available, 205,000 were chambered in 7.62 by 54R. Nearly 202,000 of these would be M91 Mosins. The others were the 1895 Winchesters. About half of the rest were Arisakas, with the others being miscellaneous. 790 of the 985 machine guns held were also chambered in 54R. Many of the Mosins were in poor condition from not only being rode hard and put up wet, but poor storage conditions exacerbated this deterioration. 4 initial state-run armories would set up, I'm not going to pronounce that word, I'll put it across the screen, or AV1 through AV4, with 5 more being set up during the Continuation War. While most Civil Guard districts possess their own small facilities for repairs. Lacking an industry to produce new firearms, Finland looked to add small arms via purchases from abroad. Initially, they purchased almost anything, including a mixed assortment of captured German arms as well as Spanish rubies from France in May 1919. The rubies were quickly considered junk, as the .32 ACP cartridge is considered too weak, and there wasn't much interchangeability among these pistols. Take a look at my ruby video, link above, for more information on that. As they became more focused on consolidating around the 7.62x54R, the German rifles and machine guns would be traded to Poland for Mosins and Russian Maxims. Since none of the European powers had interest in keeping captured Mosins from the war, Finland would scour Europe to purchase them. Captain Arvos Salaranta would be sent to Italy to obtain their stock of captured Mosins and Russian Maxims. This would net them around 40,000 rifles. Now remember this trip to Italy, as it will play an important part in my next video in this series. There would be trades with other nations such as Albania, where Finland would offload some of their Arasaka stock for Mosins. The Ministry of Defense would partner with Finnish international trading company Oy Transbaltic AB in 1927 to obtain more rifles and ammunition. Oy Transbaltic would scour Europe for Mosins, sell them to the Finnish government, who would sell their stock of German Mausers or Japanese Arasakas and ammo to the company, who would either sell or trade it in Europe for more Mosins. By 1935, Oy Transbaltic AB had obtained most European-sourced Mosins for Finland. This has been a 1,000-foot view of how Finland obtained their Mosins. For more details of the trades, please refer to D'Orazio's book. As stated earlier, Finland never produced their own Mosin receiver, so all Finnish Mosins were reworked from rifles originally made in Russia, the United States, or France. Many of the rifles on hand after the Civil War became unusable, and barrels were severely corroded. The rifles brought in by the Ministry of Defense and Oy Transbaltic AB were a mixture of complete rifles and rifles that were cannibalized for parts. While Finn M91 rifles would be interchangeable with Russian Soviet rifles, there are some changes and upgrades that needed to be made, on top of just making the rifles serviceable. Barrels were a major issue in the beginning, as Finnish arms industry lacked the capacity to produce large quantities of them. This would lead to the Army and Civil Guard trying a couple of different methods, which I'll cover in the next video in this series. There's an early abortive attempt to produce barrels at SAT. Tikhakovsky would produce around 11,000 barrels, which would be mated to rifles at AV-1. Tikhakovsky would really ramp up during the winter and continuation wars and produce 45,000 barrels for the M91. Another needed change is modifying the Russian Konovalov rear sight, along with adding a new raised blade front sight. The Russian sights were in an old unit called Arshins, which is around 2 1/3 feet or 7.112 meters. The sight would be marked 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 for hundreds of Arshins on the left side of the sight. Since the Finns used meters, this needed to be remedied. They had marked the existing notches for 3, 4, 5.5, 7, and 8.5 on the right side of the sight. The Arshin markings would either be crossed out or completely milled off. Later on, another notch would be milled into the sight for a 200-meter minimum. Other changes included going to an Austrian-style swing swivel, whether via a plate escutcheon or adding a metal sling through the old-school Russian sling slot. The advantage of the latter was that a leather hanger could be used if necessary. There were no real modifications to the bolt or trigger. Wood stocks would be recycled until they were unusable. There was a batch of thicker Tikhakovsky barrels that were thicker and stepped, similar to the 91 24 rifles I'll get to in the next video, that required a deepening of the channel in the stock and handguard. In talking about the markings, it needs to be noted that there are two main production runs for the M91 in Finland. The initial run in the 1920s and a much larger run in the 1940s during the wars. Finn M91 with previous Russian markings kept their original barrels, whereas many of the receivers of the rebarreled rifles might be or might not be scrubbed, for example AV-1. Where or how the barrel was produced would be the label we give the rifle. In the 1920s rifles, this would be the initial SAT experiment, which only numbered 156 rifles. Tikhakovsky, which is around 11,000, and the P-Series barrels, which I'll delve to in the next video, along with the Civil Guard's 91 24s. Spoiler alert for future videos, but both the Army and Civil Guard would replace the M91 in the late 20s with the M27, M28, and M28-30, and they'd be ordered to get along and consolidate on one design, which would be the M39. The general pissing contest between the Army and Civil Guard would cause a delay in production of the M39 as war clouds loomed. M91 production would again ramp up after the Soviet invasion, and the M39 would totally miss out on the Winter War. Finland seemed to not throw everything away, and many M91 parts were laying around. When it was said and done, the Army would order 48,000 barrels from the State Rifle Factory VKT and 33,000 barrels from Tikkakoski. Around 8,000 of the VKT barrels will have a B marking, which were barrels that came from Belgium prior to the German invasion there. Tikkakoski and VKT would attach their barrels to awaiting receivers, pressure test them with a hot 7.62 by 53R ammo, and send them to AV1 and AV3 for finishing. It is here and later refurbishment where many rifles would receive the two-piece fin stock. The VKT would thoroughly scrub the receivers of previous markings, while Tikka wasn't so thorough or didn't bother to scrub them at all. As for the SA mark that is ubiquitous on Finnish arms, that is the Finnish Army stamp standing for Suomi Armeija, and came into place in late 1942, replacing the, again I'm going to put that across the screen, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that mark. If any of your Finn firearms possess the SA mark, that means they went through an Army depot after that date. Even with the M27, M28, 28-30, and M39, the M91 rifle would still make up around half what the Finnish military's rifles used during the Winter and Continuation Wars. VKT would cease production after 1942, while Tikka would make some into 1943. After the war, the M91 would be placed in reserve until they were surplus and brought to the United States by Century Arms in the 1990s. Shooting a Finn M91 is identical to the Russian M91. To get a closer look at two of my Finn M91 rifles, click over here where the author of the Finnish Mosin Nagant, Matt D'Orazio, looks over my rifles. Otherwise, please join the GOA and get $5 off your membership with the link below. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.